Welcome to Casual Friday. Hi, I'm Roxanne Richardson, and this is my weekly Casual Friday podcast. If you'd like to jump right to a specific point in the video, you can use the chapter links in the video timeline. So this week, I have some tidbits to tell you. I am going to answer a question about reverse engineering a sweater from a historic photograph. I have some new yarn that came from overseas that I want to show you. I'm going to tell you briefly about the works in progress I have going on, and then I'm going to talk to you about a sweater research project that I'm working on. So let's get started. So I have a few tidbits this week. The first one I want to tell you about is a Civil War knitting sheath that was discovered in a field somewhere in Maryland. So if you're from outside the US, Maryland is on the East Coast. It's one of the states that's right near our US capital, Washington, D.C. The sheath that they found was actually, it's shaped like a fish, and on the back side of this decorated fish is a little tube that is the actual sheath that the needle goes into. So if you don't know what a knitting sheath is, I will explain it to you. This functions similarly to a knitting sheath. This is a knitting belt. So this is a piece of leather that is stuffed with horsehair, and it has a belt that you wrap around your waist. So you can actually tuck your knitting project, if it's larger, you can tuck it between your belt and your body, and that holds the weight of it. Well, and you can use this while you're walking around. That's the point of it, is that you could continue knitting even though you were walking somewhere back and forth. So the way these work is that you would have long knitting needles that were double pointed like this, and that this has a number of different holes. You could insert it into one of those holes, and because there's all that horsehair in there, it stays there. And that just holds your knitting needle stable. It just stabilizes the needle, so you don't actually have to hold the needle. And that, if you knit with the yarn in your right hand, that leaves your right hand free to handle the yarn without needing to actually hold the needle. This is actually how I knit when I'm knitting English style, when I'm doing flat work that I want to knit English style. I don't use a knitting belt, but I do anchor the needle. So when I knit, I use like a 14-inch long needle, and that has a ball at the end of it. And I anchor that at the junction of my hip and thigh. And that holds the needle up right in position where I can knit it. And so I am managing the movement, the insertion of the right needle through the stitches by holding my left hand and mounting the stitch onto that needle. So my left hand brings the stitch onto the right needle and off of the right needle like that, and then my right hand is what handles moving the yarn around the needle to complete the stitch. So it can be really efficient. This is how Shetland knitters, production knitters, would have knit. The Civil War era knitting sheath that they found is a sheath, not a belt. And so what that is, instead of sticking the needle into something like this that's kind of padded and full of horsehair, instead they insert it into a tube. So again, the tube could be something that you would tuck into maybe your apron, or into, again, a belt around your waist that you could also tuck your knitting into. But it serves the same purpose. It's just inserted into that sheath, and then that allows the needle to be anchored. So it's a pretty cool find, I think, for here in the United States, because our history is so much shorter, and we don't have the same history of like production knitting that they have in the UK, where everybody would have been knitting. People would have been knitting here, but probably more likely just for themselves and their families, I think. But anyway, if you are interested in seeing what that sheath looks like, there's a link down in the video description. So the next thing I'm going to tell you about came from one of you guys. I don't know if it was in the comments last week or the week before, but I've told you several times that I follow this woman. She's a fashion historian from the UK. Her name is Dr. Kate Strasden, and I follow her on Twitter because she always posts every day some gorgeous photograph that's stored at a museum collection in one place or another. And then she talks about what it is about this piece of fashion from, you know, the specific era it's from and how it's like other things of that era, like what are the pieces of that clothing that are typical for the age, and then what's unusual about it, this particular piece, or what's really interesting about it, that sort of thing. And sometimes she posts really, really funny posts as well that have to do with fashion history. Well, she, like everybody, had to stay home this spring and summer. And so the speaking engagements that she had planned for the summer were canceled. So she's doing them over Zoom and things like that. So she decided to do some short talks. They're like 10 to 12 minutes long maximum, I think, about different topics that are of interest to her that she hopes is of interest to other people. And one of the things that I've seen her tweet about in the past that she did a video on is on women mountaineers of the 19th century and the clothing that they wore while they were mountaineering. And it was a topic that she researched for her master's degree. And what she had noticed was that the photographs that would show these women who are wearing, you know, typical 19th century clothing, they had corsets and they had their long skirts and things like that, that there was usually some kind of a caption that sort of belittled the women or was dismissive of them and their ability to actually truly mountaineer, and they would have had to have been basically carried along. They weren't really mountaineering. That sort of dismissive about that. So she decided to research these women. And so what she talks about in this one video is like the alterations to the clothing, the things that they did to the clothing, like that would work like a Roman blind, that would bring the skirts kind of up, you know, so that they were not hanging in the way, or that they could be tied up in some way. And it's just really interesting. And so she has a video on the mountaineers, which I was really interested in, but she's also got videos on other topics. And so I'm going to put a link down to her YouTube channel in case you're interested, because she always has, even though I'm not a person who cares much about fashion today, I just think the history of the clothing that we wear is so important to everybody, because it does relate to everybody's life. Like the clothing that we wear today came from the clothing that we wore in previous generations, and the sweaters that we're knitting today are the result of an evolution of sweaters as well. So I find all of that really interesting, and it also helps me understand actually knitting within the context of other fashion as well. So the next thing I want to tell you, I see this come up every once in a while, or I search for it or something. Another person I follow on Twitter is Corey Stamper. She used to work at Merriam-Webster, the dictionary company, until past couple of years ago. She moved on from there. She is a knitter. And she wrote an article about knitting terms for Merriam-Webster, and it was like 10 knitting terms and then what they mean and sort of what the origins of them are. So I'm going to link to that down below as well. So this week I've been doing a lot of research in old knitting manuals. I do this periodically. I go back and I'm like, oh, I wonder if there's anything in those manuals about such and such. Like originally I was researching grafting, so I was only focused on sock knitting and specifically grafting and how it was used, and that's how I would look at them. And so this week I've been looking at sweaters and upper body garments in the 19th century. One of the resources I use is called archive.org. It used to just be like what was called the Wayback Machine, where if a website disappeared, you could find it archived. You could at least find the text that had been on those web pages. But now they archive books as well. And when I was originally looking at trying to find old knitting manuals, if I just searched for knitting or knitting manuals, I wouldn't find very much. And then I realized that this University of Southampton in the UK had this huge library of books that they had scanned and that they put on archive.org under the terms Knitting Reference Library. And another was Victorian Knitting Manuals. So I could find them that way. What I found out this week is now I can just type the word knitting and I can get all of those books that also appear in the Victorian Knitting Library and the Knitting Reference Library. There'll be a little icon attached to that particular result, and you can tell that that's part of that collection, but you can look at it no matter what. So I'll leave a link to archive.org below, because I think it's really fascinating. But there's all kinds of books that are related to textiles. Like I've also found, for example, the dictionary of, I think it's called the Dictionary of Needlework or Dictionary of Textiles or something like that. There's actually probably a dictionary of each. That was originally published in 1915. And this has helped me tremendously when doing research, say, on vintage yarns and not understanding what these yarns are. They were listed in that book and described, at least you could understand what the fiber content was, for example. And that book has been updated a number of times over the past 100 years. They maintain all of the stuff that was originally in there, and then they include anything new in textiles as well. So it's really handy, but it's nice to be able to see that original one. So that's another example of the kinds of things that you can find that are textile related in archive.org. So in the process of doing some research, I came across a sweater pattern that came from Butterick, which is, if you sew, you may recognize Butterick sewing patterns. But they had a magazine, a women's magazine back in the 19th century called the Dilineator, and it was published, I think, from the 1860s, somewhere around there, up through 1937. There's an organization called the HathiTrust, which it turns out is like a consortium of universities, mostly public research universities. I think the one exception might be that Northwestern University is in there. But they're the Big 10 universities, which I will show you a map of what that looks like up here. There's 14 universities in the Big 10 now. And the Big 10 actually refers to the athletic conference that these universities are part of. But it's the Big 10, really 14 universities, plus the 11 libraries of the various universities of California branches. So they have banded together, and so they have all of their books or resources are scanned, and you can look at them on there. You can't necessarily download something. You might be able to download a page or a series of pages from a particular publication, but you have to be part of one of the universities that is in the HathiTrust in order to be able to download the entire publication. What they have are a bunch of issues of this magazine called the Dilineator. And so it's a women's magazine, so it has a lot of fashion things, but it also has articles, it has stories, it also has knitting, crocheting, netting, tatting, embroidery. They have all kinds of, women's interest things. But one of the things that they also have often are these articles about women's issues. So there might be an article about women in business, or why pharmacy is an excellent occupation for women, for example. So what I was looking for was going through and looking at the knitting. So I'd look in the table of contents, find out where the knitting was, and then go look. And oftentimes it's like lace, it's like things you'd find in stitch dictionaries. It's stitch patterns, but sometimes they have garments. Sometimes it might just be baby garments, but every once in a while there's a sweater pattern. So I was looking at all of those sweater patterns, and what I noticed at the end of the knitting section, at least for a period of time, they would have one of these interesting articles about women in business or something like that. And I happened to see that there was in the table of contents, there was something about like college news. And they had this whole article about athletics, and it was an article describing basketball and the rules of basketball, and it was young women playing basketball, and they were wearing sweaters. And the kinds of sweaters they were wearing were pretty just shapeless. Basically those were considered athletic jerseys back in the 19th century. So at first, people just wore whatever, and then they realized we need to be able to differentiate the teams. They'd have a letter on them, or they might be a different color or something like that. So there's a bunch of pictures of the girls doing things like, what does a foul look like? What does it look like if you're waiting for a pass? What does it look like before the setup? And they're wearing these sweaters, and you can see how long they are. and the hems are turned up. And this is something that I've seen a lot in the early 1900s sweaters for men. They just would make them so long. And I thought, why are they making them so long? And then they would do this thing where they would flip up the hem for some reason. I don't know why. It might have just been the fashion. But sweaters were something that you saw more on college campuses because the team sports was more of a thing then, and that they had more casual attire than you would see, than you'd see adults wearing. So a lot of the sweater wearing in those early years went on college campuses. But I thought that the article about basketball is really interesting. I also found out that in addition to the issues that the HathiTrust has on the Dilineator, there's another website that showed all of the different locations on the internet that have issues of the Dilineator and what those issues are. So if you are looking for a particular time period and you don't see it in one place, maybe it would be in another. So I'll leave links both to the HathiTrust Dilineator stockpile, as well as the website that explains where you can find other issues as well, and then specifically to the one on the basketball article, because I think that that's fun to read through and see if you're interested. So I had a question because I talk a lot about how I do genealogy, and then I'm really interested in these vintage and knitting patterns, and I like to combine the two, and I use a lot of the same resources or research approaches when I'm doing research on sweaters that I do when I'm researching family history. And so somebody had a question about, she said, on the mention of genealogy intersecting with historical knitting, I have come across a photo of my great-great-grandmother wearing a knitted cardigan. Would there be resources to help reverse engineer a sweater from a historic photograph? So here's my approach to how I would go about doing that, especially if you're on Ravelry. I'm a member of two groups that I would probably use to help me get started. The first one would be the Knitting Genealogists group. It's a fantastic resource if you like to do genealogical resource. I find it incredibly helpful. There are people from all over the world. They all like to do research. They love hearing about your research breakthroughs. They love helping solve mysteries. So a lot of times people will post a photo there and like, anybody have any idea about what time period this might be? And the clues that we use are things like hairstyles, collars for men or neckties, the dress style, all of that stuff together. We can kind of pinpoint the time period. So unless you know when that photograph was taken, or how old the great-great-grandmother was in the photo, or you know when she died, so you know, well, it had to be before this time period, that kind of thing. So you can first thing you do is get a sense of what time period that photograph was taken. The next thing you can do is go to another Ravelry group called All Things Vintage. And so that's for vintage knitting, vintage crochet. There's a woman in there who does a lot of, I think she is a costumer at a theater, but she does a lot of vintage sewing and purchasing of vintage items and things like that. So it really is all things vintage. So you can post a photo of that and see if anyone recognizes the sweater pattern possibly, or has seen a sweater like that. Because then what you could do is you pinpoint the time frame. So you know that the sweater would have been knit sometime before that. You don't know how long great-great-grandma had that cardigan. Then you think, okay, what were the common knitting magazines or knitting books in that time period in that country? Because that's going to make a difference too. Are we talking about UK? We're talking about Australia? We're talking about US, Canada? You know, that's going to make a difference. So if it was American, I would look at Fleischer's, Columbia, Minerva. You know, those were Corticelli. I would look at those knitting books in those eras and see if I could find something. And then the other thing is to have some sense of, in general, how were sweaters constructed in that time period. So that's something that I'm starting to learn quite a bit. And so a lot of times, especially the earlier it was, the simpler the construction was. And so if you're trying to just replicate that general look, that could be fairly simple. If there's some particular aspect of the sweater that you find really interesting or unusual and you're not sure how it would have been done, then the people in All Things Vintage group could talk about, well, what might that be, or and ways to approach it. So that is how I would start. Once you get a sense of the time period and kind of the construction details that you're looking to replicate, then you can start thinking about things like yarn weight and needle size and stitch patterns and things like that. So I have not gone to any yarn stores, I don't think, since this year started. And I haven't actually bought very much yarn either. I bought a little bit of yarn. I certainly bought the yarn for my Roaring 20s sweater. That was the beginning of the year. It's probably like the big yarn purchase I made. And then, you know, I was working on that for a couple of months. And then right about the point that I was kind of tired of working on it anyway, then we had the virus thing started and the lockdown, and it was really hard to focus on anything big anyway. And so I began doing a series of smaller projects. I just started a whole bunch of things, and so that I could sort of latch on to whatever I could do. And one of the things that I did was order yarn from Jamieson and Smith for a hat that was last year's Shetland Wool Week pattern. So every year they have, in Shetland, they have a Shetland Wool Week, and it's usually, I think it's like the end of September. And 6 months ahead of time, they announce a hat pattern for Shetland Wool Week. So the pattern is designed by somebody important to the Shetland wool industry. It might be someone who's been a Shetland wool sheep farmer for 50 years or something like that. That was what it was for 2019. And in his case, he had the idea of the elements he wanted in the hat, and then there was a designer who actually designed it. And then what they do is they create 4 different colorways for the hat, and they have one colorway from each of 4 different yarn producers. So the 2 big yarn producers are Jamieson's of Scotland, and then Jamieson and Smith. So those are 2 different companies. And then there's one that they did for sure for 2019 and then for this year, which is like an organic Shetland wool producer. And then the 4th one might be one that gets rotated. I'm not really sure. Again, I've only done 2019 and then I got the 2020 pattern. Those are the only ones I have. I haven't looked in the past to see what they've done before. And this year, the 4th one was Shetland hand spun. So I think the idea was that you would either hand spin your own, or you could possibly order it from somebody. I don't know. I knit at the 2019 pattern during the beginning of all of this lockdown stuff using Jamieson and Smith yarn, a colorway that I ordered from them. And I was able to order it directly from them. And so when this year's pattern came out, I looked at the 4 colorways and I thought, oh, I really like the one from Jamieson's of Scotland. And so the yarn that they would use is called Spindrift. So I thought, well, I'll just order the exact colors that are in that colorway. I really like that particular colorway. I just order them from Jamieson's. And I was doing my whole order, and then it couldn't go through because it said they have a North American distributor. And so you can't, if you live in North America, you can't buy directly from Jamieson's. So I knew that there are a lot of yarn shops that sell Spindrift. And I knew, for example, I live in Minnesota and Wisconsin is very close by. And I know Schoolhouse Press, which is Elizabeth Zimmerman's company that her daughter, Meg Swenson, runs now. I know, that they carry Spindrift. So I looked on their website. Well, as soon as they announced the pattern and the different colorways, people go and buy them. And so the colors for those particular colorways were sold out everywhere. And I mean, I could find plenty of places to buy Spindrift. I just couldn't find the exact colors. So I was having trouble with that. And then I think the next week I found a Canadian shop that was selling kits of the colorway. So I'm like, yes. So I ordered the kit, and then they emailed me and said, oh, we sold out of it, but I can send you some substitute colors. Now, the reason I prefer, doing a kit anyway to picking my own, especially when you're talking about 5 different colors, is I find it very intimidating, partially colorblind, and trying to pick them out on a computer is like, forget it. It's not going to work. I said, well, what would the colors be? And so she told me the names of them. I looked them up and I'm like, well, those look pretty much almost exactly like the original ones. So I ordered the kit. It took a couple weeks. It came here. They're very pretty colors, and I just put the kit aside. I haven't done anything with it yet. Well, I don't know, a week or two ago, I got a message from a woman named Jenny who lives in Scotland, and she had been watching those videos from earlier this spring when I was having trouble getting the yarn. And she said, I live right in Scotland. I'm going to the Jameson's shop this week. I'll just get you all the colors and I'll send them to you. And I was like, oh, that's really sweet. Not necessary. I got these substitute colors. So I have the yarn. She goes, no. She's a nurse. And she's like, I need to do something for somebody. Please let me do this. I'm buying the yarn. Just tell me where to send it. So she sent me the yarn and it came, and it's beautiful. And it's really interesting. I laid them out. I laid out the colors that she sent me, and then I laid out the colors that the Canadian company sent me. And it's really interesting because the Canadians, the substitutions are very good. I mean, they look really nice together. But there are some differences, and it's really interesting to see the original colors. There's just something about that combination that really I just love. So I'll put some pictures up here so you can see the difference. There was, out of the 5 colors, there was one color that was the same that the Canadian company did have, which is called Madder. But the other colors were not quite the same. Like the Canadian company, the dark blue is almost like a bright dark blue, whereas the original one is really more of a midnight, really deep, more heathery. It's just different. And then the other color is, the original is like a blue-green heathery color. And the Canadian company sent one that was a blue heathery, and they're like the same color value. Like if you were to take a picture in black and white, they would look the same. They're just slightly different. And again, the combination the Canadian company, the Canadian shop picked is really nice. But there's something about this original. It's just nice to have it. And I so appreciate it. So thank you very much, Jenny. I really appreciate that so much. So I got another package from Scotland at almost the same time. I had forgotten I'd even ordered this. So I was talking about Dr. Kate Strasden, the fashion historian. Well, she follows other fashion historians. They all follow each other. So I picked up a whole bunch of them along the way, including some women who are professors at the University of Glasgow. And one of them decided to learn to knit. She felt bad because she was the only one in the entire department who didn't know how to knit, and she's at home. And so she decided to knit. And she was showing her little learn to knit book and her needles and her glass of wine, and then the yarn. And I looked at it and I'm like, wait a second. The yarn label said University of Glasgow. And I said, wait, what? You guys have your own yarn? And they said, yeah, it was the brainchild of two women. One of them was a visiting professor. She actually lives in Wisconsin now. They decided it would be really good for the university to have its own sheep and create its own wool and process it and whatever. And then they have this wool. So they have 4 colors. It's the Cachno Farm wool is what it is. So it's a Cachno Farm, University of Glasgow. Cachno means little cup, place of little cups, with reference to cup and ring markings on stones in the area. So I ordered one of each color. So there's this color. I don't know if they say what the name of the color is on here. Thistle. This is Thistle. It's a DK weight yarn. This one is University Blue, so I assume that that's their school colors. This is Slate. And then this one is just the natural color. So I got one of each of the 4 colors. I ordered it back then. Of course, everything was on lockdown. And I ordered it from their university gift shop. I'll leave a link down below if you want to find it. It was kind of tricky to find it in the gift shop. Like I had to, they didn't have just like yarn and you can order however many colors. Like I had to find each color somehow separately. Maybe it's easier now. So I ordered it, and I mean, it wasn't any rush to get it. And they sent me an email a couple of days later along with a 20% refund because everything was closed and they weren't going to be able to ship it out. And so recently everything opened back up again, and it just arrived. I'm like, what is this? So I have these 4 colors now. And I need to figure out what to do with them. I'm planning on doing, let's see, it's kind of it's probably a little itchy. I'm planning a series of videos on hats and like crown shaping and different ways of doing that. And maybe these would be good for demonstrating that. But I definitely am going to use all of these in some way. But I just wanted to share those with you. You know, it's summertime and we've had some really hot weather. Like this week was just beautiful, but today super hot again. So I oftentimes just knit socks in the summer because it keeps the wool off of my lap. So I've been knitting that. I knit a pair, I don't have the ends woven in yet, just a pair of socks for my daughter in the Netherlands. Just standard socks. I used Mountain Colors Barefoot, which to me, it's got a little bit of mohair in it. I think it also has nylon, I believe. And it's supposed to be machine washable, and it usually is for a while, and then the socks start to shrink. But they are the warmest socks that I have. And so if it's really cold, this socks made from Barefoot is something that I use. So I finished those, but while I was knitting them, or while I was working on them, my daughter said, Sam wants to know if you can knit him one of these. And she sent me this picture. It was like a screen capture from some like comedy quiz show. I don't know what it was, some show from the UK. He thinks he's kidding, but you don't kid with somebody like me, a knitter, and it's like a challenge. So I knit him a little hat with the leftovers from her sock to go on his big toe. So a couple of weeks ago, I finished my Roaring 20s sweater, and I was talking about it, and I talked about how I wasn't sure I would ever want to wear it when I started it. And then when I finished it, I tried it on and went, yeah, I'm not going to wear it. And so I was telling you guys about that, and I got all these comments about, well, can you modify it in this way to make it more wearable? And I had gone through this, like, why are they telling me that? Don't they, that would just ruin my whole larger project. And then last Thursday, I did a talk to the Tigard Oregon Knitters Guild talking about this larger project that I'm working on. And I knew that they probably wouldn't know who I was or anything about my project, and I had to figure out like how to explain the whole project. And it was then that I realized, oh, a lot of you probably don't realize that there is a bigger project that the individual vintage sweater is a part of. And so I explained that I have this larger project of knitting my way through the 20th century, decade by decade, one sweater at a time. And what I'm looking for is, you know, fashion changes and how construction methods were affected in some respects by fashion, but just maybe evolving techniques, and what kind of influences would have caused these construction methods to change. And, you know, the use of techniques, for example, how were they seaming things back then versus how we seam things now, and how did we make that transition? Or another example is the kinds of short row techniques that they used back then and versus the ones that we use today. And you know, how did that change? Like when did things change, and were there things you could point to that said, well, that is this event or that person or that book or whatever really influenced this change. So that is what I'm really interested in looking at. So when I did the presentation in Oregon, at the end, there was a woman named Ellen who goes by Twinset Ellen is her kind of screen name. She is an identical twin sister, and years ago they did a podcast together, like an audio podcast. She was part of our guild, and I often would take a class at Yarn Over, which is our guild's annual sort of teaching conference thing where we bring teachers from all over. And she would sometimes end up being in the same class that I was in. And she was in a class that we took on Japanese short rows. And it was right when I had learned this method of doing short rows that was in a German book. And I had an idea that they were probably the same as Japanese short rows, but I found Japanese short rows so tedious, and so I just wanted to take a class where I'd be forced to work through the whole process and really understand Japanese short rows really well so that I could then understand these other short rows. And the two of us during a break, I was like, oh, do you think these are the same? These are the same? And she's like, yeah. And so I'm like, okay, I'm going to call them German short rows. So that's how the whole German short row thing came about, at least the label for that technique that I got from a book here up on my shelf. So this is, that's the Ellen I knew. So at the end of this Oregon presentation, we opened for questions, and she's like, hi, Rox, it's Ellen. And I'm like, wait a second, what are you doing there? So she said to me, I think you should write a book about this. And I don't even remember exactly what I said. It basically was, it'll be so hard and it's so overwhelming and whatever. And she's like, oh, just do it like grad students. You just have like 10 articles. So, one article for each sweaters basically. And she goes, and just smush them together. I'm like, oh yeah. So I was just like, oh, that, I thought, well, that's an interesting idea. And it was an interesting way to break something down that would seem so overwhelming, but I didn't really think much about it. But then on the next day, when I explained to all of you guys what this larger project is, I got comment after comment after comment. You should make this into a book. Have you ever considered writing this as a book? And I kept getting that. And I thought, well, that's interesting because I have had many book ideas in my life. And some of them I worked on for a while. Some were fiction, some were nonfiction, some were family history, some of them were knitting related. I had just come to the conclusion that I do not have the persistence to actually stick through a whole book project. For a long time, I didn't even think I could do a really huge project. But it was working through the Master Hand Knitting program that showed me that I could get through a really big long-term project with only my own motivation. I didn't have deadlines, so you have to have this part done by then. It was all on me. And there were times when I would take a break from it. I'd work on it intensively for a few weeks, and then I'd be like, oh, I just need a break from this. And I'd go do something else for a few months, and then I'd get pulled back into it. And it was during that time when I was also learning that I could have multiple projects, and then I could abandon things for a while and then maybe come back and finish them, that I started to realize, oh, I had this 3-week tolerance thing with my knitting projects. And I had that with the Master Hand Knitting program too, where I can work intensively on something, have all this focus. And then I just get sort of mentally tired, and I'm a curious person. I really like to learn and expose myself to all kinds of new things. So I would get antsy and be like, oh, I just need to put this to the side. So I learned in the 7 years it took me to do the Master Hand Knitting program with a 4-year break in the middle that I can finish things and that I do come back to them with a lot of enthusiasm. But a book was something that I just didn't think that I could do or would want to do. And so I've put it to the side. I mean, I'm a writer. I have a degree in writing. I write technical articles. I spend half my day writing. So the writing isn't the issue. It's getting through the whole project. I did spend last weekend thinking about that, like thinking about, well, what would it look like if it was just 10 chapters, one on each sweater? Would I be happy with that? Like, because I also think of things in terms of story, like what is the arc, or what's the through line, or what is the overall meaning behind all of this? Not just I knit this sweater and then I knit this sweater and I knit this sweater, but what is the overall meaning to it? So I just kind of began thinking about it and thinking about, well, what would I need to research? Like, what would I need to know? What more do I need to know about the sweater's backstory? Because I deliberately started in the 1900s because I knew that sweaters, as we think of them today, are really the product of the end of the 19th century. We can look at Scandinavian wool shirts that were worn as part of their costume, that especially like Danish women wore for a couple hundred years. And we can look to some extent at fishermen ganzes, but that history of that is really confused and muddled and difficult to find out the true history of the fisherman's gansey. I mean, there's claims that it's hundreds of years old. It's not clear to me. So there are questions I need to ask. So I spent this week just really going through these 19th century books that I'd looked at before when I was researching grafting. In particular, looked at the sweater patterns of the 1890s. Because I only knew of one sweater pattern for women from the 1890s, and it was printed in 1897. It was actually reprinted. It was a collection of patterns from Butterick that I believe had been previously printed in the Dilineator, but I'm not sure if they had some other publications where they also published knitting patterns. I don't know. And because not all issues of the Dilineator are available, it's hard to pinpoint where some of these patterns originally occurred. I was able to find a boy's sweater pattern in this collection, this 1897 pattern that I had seen in an earlier Delineator publication. But the woman's sweater was this, it's this cycling sweater, and it's a hand knit version of the one that you may have seen in the Metropolitan Museum has in its collection. That one is machine knit. And I realized it was machine knit when I looked at it really up close and saw they had there's a stitch pattern that's kind of zigzaggy. And some people might say, oh, that's like Rick-Rack rib. Sort of, but it's not. It's definitely done by machine, something that would be very difficult and tedious and not something an average home hand knitter would want to do. But, I have no desire to knit those giant balloon sleeves of 1897. So I just started with the 1900s. So men's sweaters go back a little bit earlier. And then I was able to find a pattern for girls or boys jersey, which is basically underwear, wool underwear, long sleeve wool underwear that's close fitting and knit very much, like some of these early sweaters were knit. And so that's been really interesting. And then I've spent the rest of the week, really looking at just upper body garments of different types and how they were constructed. So that's what I've been doing this week. So I'm thinking about this. The thing is, because I spent a number of years trying to write a novel, trying to write several novels, none of them which got finished. And I have a lot of friends who are published, multi-published authors. And I know a fair amount about publishing, and publishing has changed a lot since then. Things have only gotten worse. There's that whole issue of how would it even get published? Would, traditional publishing versus self-publishing, and self-publishing adds on another horrendously large, detail-oriented project to do something that I'm not really interested in order to get the end product. So I can't even think about that. I mean, I have to think about what do I want to write about and then write about it, whether it gets published or not. So I will continue to keep you updated on what I learn and what I think it means, because really this kind of research is like scientific research or like doing family history research, where you have a certain number of pieces of information and you build a story around that, or you build a hypothesis around what does this mean. And then you get a new piece of information and you realize, well, if this is true, then that changes what this other stuff means. And so you just keep building on that context and building and building. And you start to see what could be true or what might be false, and what other hypotheses, how things are all interconnected together in terms of the history of knitting and the history of hand knitting and sweaters, and how machine knitting influenced all of that in the 19th century. So there are a lot of moving parts to it that I'm finding very interesting. So I did hear all those comments. You should write a book about this. And it does seem like it could be something manageable, because it would be in conjunction with actually knitting the things that I'd be talking about, which is going to take time and which I take breaks from. It could be something that I actually do and finish and see through to the end, because those natural breaks are built in. My enthusiasm will probably keep going forward, I hope. Well, that's it for this week's Casual Friday. If you have any comments or questions about today's video, or suggestions for videos you'd like to see in the future, you can leave those down in the comments below, or join the discussion in my Ravelry group, Rox Rocks. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you next week.